Nidesh Lawtoo is assistant professor of philosophy in the Husserl Archives, Center for Phenomenology and Continental Philosophy here at KU Leuven. Since 2016, Professor Lawtoo has been principal investigator of the ERC-funded project entitled Homo Mimeticus: Theory and Criticism. This project explores the role of mimesis in philosophy, literature, social sciences, and film. But also, as the book shows, in politics, although that was not exactly planned. And the book is an effect of a convergence of three factors. One, problems and themes discussed separately in previous works, especially regarding the usages of similar ideas, and quite frankly, the same concepts, such as the mimetic unconscious, mimetic pathology, and hypermimesis. More about these concepts later on. Two, intellectual exchanges with such contemporary political thinkers as William Connolly, Jane Bennett, and others. And three, Nidesh's general observation of the modern world, especially the interplay between the entertainment and politics, and his own personal experience of the changing today. This book, written in a very narrative and accessible way, engages concepts and methodologies tried and tested in the fields of philosophy, literature, and film studies to identify, diagnose, and understand a social political phenomenon to which we could be oblivious using the reason-oriented, if not typical apparatus inherited from the tradition of the Enlightenment. On many levels, the new Fascism book by Nidesh Lawtoo feels more personal than others from his output. It features a personally laden preface, acknowledgement, and introduction. In its body, the book features three chapters and a dialogue. They are Crowd Psychology Redux, 2, The Mimetic Community, and 3, The Power of the Myth Reloaded. The fourth part, Coda, is a transcript of a dialogue between Nidesh Lawtoo and the already mentioned thinker William Connolly, entitled Fascism Now and Then. William Connolly and Nidesh Lawtoo in conversation. Although we'll talk about the title of the book as such, let me mention that the three concepts in its subtitle represent the main focal points, or pivots, for the three chapters in the book, namely Contagion, Community, and Myth. A very telling and concise foreword to the book is offered by Professor Mikkel Borch-Jacobsen from the University of Washington in Seattle. For those of us with limited exposure to mimesis, let me read another passage from this book. Schematically, mimesis can be linked to both representation and vision, as well to mimicry and affect. A realist painter is said to imitate or represent nature, not unlike a realist novelist represents the world. But then a child also imitates his parents, a student his or her teachers, and people generally imitate figures they admire and who serve as models, good or bad. While the dominant tendency so far has been to translate mimesis in terms of representation, I'm interested in behavioral, affective, and as you also say, contagious dimensions of mimesis, what some call mimeticism. Figures like Plato, Nietzsche, Tarde, Girard, Lacoue-Labarthe, Borch-Jacobsen, and others promote analogous views. On the shoulders of this tradition, I like to remind my students that mimesis comes from mimos, mime, or actor, and that it is originally linked to theatrical skills like impersonation, mimicry, and bodily performance. My sense is that there is an enormous affective power at play in mimetic skills that can be put to political use and abuse, especially in a culture that has turned politics into a form of spectacle. It's perhaps for this reason that actors turned politicians can cast such a spell on a significant segment of the population. Mimesis is thus not always manifested as an image that we consciously see, but is constitutive of an environment that we feel with all our senses. We might not be fully conscious of it, especially if we are used to our environment, but it affects us nonetheless, and deeply so. A bit like the fish that is asked by the other fish, "How is the water today?" And it answers, surprised, "What water?" Mimesis is the biocultural water we swim in. It's transparent, often imperceptible, and pervasive. Whether we like it or not, we are soaked in it, and the types of currents that surround us, from the family we are born into the schools we attend, the friends we make, and the profession we choose, the shows we watch and the people we follow online, we have a strong mimetic influence on how we feel, think, act, and eventually vote, for better and worse. Having a general view of what the book is about and what is meant by its crucial concept, mimesis, let me now turn to some questions helpful in unpacking more nuanced aspects and corners of this book. Throughout this book and in it, you consciously situate yourself as a thinker in relation to concrete political, historical, social events that you and your close ones witnessed and which are important markers or catalysts for this book. Hence the question, what are these crucial events that motivated you to write this book?
First of all, thanks so much, Wojciech, for taking the time to read the entire book, which just appeared this month, actually in August, and for this presentation. I know you're very busy, and I doubly appreciate it. And thank you all for making time to come to this event. The first week, I know we're all packed with things to go, so I really appreciate you being here and seeing sort of a good crowd this time. I would also like to thank the Husserl Archives for hosting the Homo Mimeticus project, the English unit for welcoming me on the site of arts, MDRN, my home team, and everybody is contributing to this concept of mimesis, rethinking of mimesis in their home seminar. I think it has been very productive for us to be based here, and this small book is part of this conversation that we've been having now for a couple of years. So thank you. For your question, what led me to write this book? As you mentioned, it was not exactly planned. I hadn't planned to write a book on fascism, but it didn't come out of the blue either. And it's true that for somebody like me, it's not obvious to write on contemporary politics. I'm more trained in literary theory, critical theory, some figures in continental philosophy, and so I tend to work on texts and less so on what is happening here now. So this is different from my previous output. But it doesn't come out of the blue either, and there are a number of factors that came together for me actually to sit down and write a book. And maybe just to get started, I can give you an anecdote that condenses some of these elements. I was applying for an ERC grant. When you apply for the ERC, you need to submit a very specific, detailed plan on what exactly you need to do in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, and you write like 20 pages on that. And I must say, the only reason I could write this book is because I ended up getting the grant and having the time to write something that was not initially planned, nonetheless. But when I was invited to the interview, you get 5 minutes to sum up to non-specialists, that is, people who work outside of your discipline. There was one literary theorist, but maybe one philosopher, but people from art history, archaeology, anthropology were part of the panel. And you have 5 minutes to explain not only why it matters scientifically, that is already done by the scientific part, but also why it matters to society more generally, or why it matters to other fields. And so I took a risk during that interview. I had 5 minutes, so every second counts. And when confronted with that issue, why does it matter? So what? Okay, this concept of mimesis has been around like for 2,000 years. Why we study it today? It was in 2016, and I was flying from the States to Brussels for the interview. And so I said something that might have appeared as a kind of bad joke. I said, well, I'm coming from the US, and there are some apprentice politicians who understand the mimetic game very well. And why it matters? Well, we might end up with a president who is actually one of those. And some people laughed, and some people kind of stood back. But in the end, I think that kind of anecdote kept coming back. The ERC gave me the time to actually attend conferences on subjects that at the time were beginning to resonate with the problematic of what I call new fascism here. Subjects like myth, community, contagion, emotional contagion, And so I started to attend conferences without the intention of publishing a book, but just giving papers and showing why mimesis matters for specific interventions in the field on this much discussed concept. And out of that, the book emerged. So that's part of the answer. Maybe I should also step back and say why in 2016, when Trump was not president yet, I was kind of not being sure, but sensing a potential danger in that figure when a lot of people thought it was basically a bad joke. I mean, it's not going to fly. And that has to do with the other book that you mentioned, The Phantom of the Ego. That's my first book, and it's actually a book on modernism, in which I focus primarily on literary and philosophical figures. I read Nietzsche with Joseph Conrad, or Georges Bataille with D.H. Lawrence. And one of the things that these authors had in common was a certain attention to crowd behavior, to a type of the unconscious that had not been discovered by psychoanalysis yet, because they're writing before or at the same time, and that didn't have dreams as the main entry into the unconscious, but forms of automatic mimicry and mimetic reflexes that were particularly relevant or present in the crowd. And they were all in one way or another dealing with crowd behavior. And so I started reading more around psychological theories that were around before Freud. And one discipline that was important, and the one that Borg-Jacobsen mentions, is the one of crowd psychology. Figures like Gabriel Tarde and Gustave Le Bon pointing out, for instance, that if a leader is addressing a crowd, rhetorical strategies like that would seem absurd in, let's say, in an academic context, actually work very well. And those strategies are very simple. It can be repetition, repeat the same idea, it needs to be a simple idea, use of images rather than thoughts, stirring the passions and the emotions of the crowd, especially violence and resentment and anger. So these were some of the elements that a figure like Gustave Le Bon pointed out. And so when I was looking at a figure like Trump and hearing phrases like build a wall, great again, lock her up, that didn't seem particularly effective on paper, I was actually recognizing strategies that I had studied closely via the filter of the authors that I mentioned. So that, I think, put me in a position to at least to be alert. And then the rest was made possible by the ERC grant. I would not have written this book had I not received the grant, simply because I took some risk in writing something outside my main field.
Drawing on that last line, you don't present yourself as a political thinker per se, right? You kind of clearly say that. This book, as I have indicated earlier, is very person-laden. You do a lot of personal work in the preface, acknowledgement, the introduction, and I had this impression that you're trying to explain. It's really important for you to explain what this book is really about and what this book is not about. And the question would be, what's your biggest worry regarding its kind of main misreading? What do you think?
Right, yeah, the worry. Yeah, once you write something, then send it out, and then you should stop worrying. Now it's no longer my job to worry so much. I don't worry too much about it, because I think there is a tendency, I think that we all share, and I share it too, to worry a lot about what we do. And then we turn on the news and we really see when there is something to worry about. And the influence that we have in the real world, I think it's unfortunately marginal. So my main worry is when I think of my kids and which one television is, what kind of future will they have? And I hope short books like this won't have a huge impact in changing the world. But I think that they're pointing out a problem at least. So I'm not primarily worried in this sense if I put it in perspective. But you're right in pointing out that it takes quite some time in the introduction, in the acknowledgement, the preface to explain what this book is about. And maybe your question has to do both with the content of the book and the form, or the question of style. Maybe I break it up in two. At the level of the content, well, the main worry if you write on fascism, and you write a book on fascism, which is not an historical account that attempts to explain what fascism was in the 20s and 30s, but you try to link it to the present, is to say, if you read only the title, or part of the title, is that I'm claiming that what is happening now on the far right, let's say in the US with Trump, but also in Europe with a number of figures, be it Marine Le Pen, Salvini, Orban, and so forth, Brexit, that it's the same as fascism. That's not what I'm claiming. I'm not claiming that Donald Trump is like Mussolini, or these other figures can be reduced to fascism. That's why I speak of the phantom of fascism, or the shadow of fascism. So what the book attempts to do is not to say, well, these figures are the same, but to go back to three specific aspects that were central to fascism in the 20s and 30s. The question of emotional contagion, the question of community, organic community predicated on a clear-cut distinction between inside and outside, us and them, chosen people and people that should be exterminated. The question of community, and then the question of myth as well. In Great Again, you have this idea of a mythic past that is often used in periods of crisis in order to mobilize their true mimetic emotions. So the book is not an attempt to say what is going on now is the same as what was going on in the 20s and 30s. It's not, but attempts to see, with respect to the specific affective relations that ties the leader to the crowd, which is one of the defining characteristics of fascism. Fascism, we might come back to it, it's very difficult to define, but one defining point is that the leader establishes this kind of affective, empowering relationship that is based on emotions most of the time with the crowd, in a hierarchy. With respect to that particular problematic, the question of mimesis, as understood in the modernist period, seems to me very relevant to understand what is going on today. But it's not to say that it's the same as what actually happened in the 20s and 30s, or that the same result will ensue. Scholars of fascism tend to agree on that. It's very difficult to give a unitary definition of what fascism exactly is. The most informed scholars that I've read tend to emphasize the differences between nationalities and also fascism as a process of becoming. Why does one become a fascist and not what is the fascist ideology that can be transposed from cultural context from one to the other. So that's one aspect of, I guess, the misreading that could emerge, but that's only if one reads part of the title and doesn't go to the subtitle. There are some brackets around the new, and we might come back to those. Mm-hmm. But let me come back to the question of
form. You say cover content, and you said that you also want to address the form.
Right. Since this preface, acknowledgement. By the way, some of you will be in the acknowledgement because, as I said, the Homometical seminar was was collective effort, and so in one way or another, you're implicated in it. So watch out.
Beware.
Absolutely. The style, yeah. It's not so much an attempt to avoid misunderstanding, but it's more like a rhetorical device to attempt to open up the book to a readership that would not come, let's say, to an engagement of psychology and René Girard, or how Jean-Luc rethinks the concept of community via Georges Bataille, or how Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe and Jean-Luc give us a new understanding of myth as an instrument of identification. These are the specific problematics that the book addresses, but I wanted to open up these questions to a non-academic readership as well. And once again, there the Year C project, I think really stimulated me to do that. That is, to have not only, but outputs that attempt to open up the problematic of mimesis and explain why it's important outside or beyond an academic readership. So it's more like a rhetorical strategy in which I use a personal autobiographical style at the beginning to draw the reader in a story, basically, and it's a mimetic technique. So one misunderstanding that could emerge out of the book is that this book is simply a critique of mimesis, that mimesis and the contagion and mimicry can lead only to fascism, but actually the form of the book is mimetic. I speak in my own name. It's not only diegesis, and so it's an indication that there is no outside of mimesis. It's one of the phrases that we sometimes use, and that it can be mobilized in order to combat fascism. So maybe just to give you an example, very briefly, I'll read you just a paragraph or two of the preface that Wojciech is referring to give you a sense, and you'll tell me if it works or it doesn't. Given the Nietzschean inspiration of the diagnostic that follows, I might as well begin this short genealogy of new fascism with a personal confession. I first started thinking about the power of authoritarian leaders to cast a spell on the crowd when I was based in the United States, working on a doctoral thesis that explored the haunting power of mimesis in European modernism. Fascism, I should say immediately, was not a topic I was initially planning to address, and for obvious biographical reasons. Born in the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland in the 1970s, a 30-minute drive from the Italian border, I soon picked up from the tonality of adult voices and from the effective reactions that ensued that the accusation fascista was not to be taken lightly. It was rarely mimicked among us children on the courtyard of a school, but when it was used, as a fight would escalate, for instance, or as a bully would boss us around, it inevitably triggered an automatic reflex in the accused to set up a maximum distance from whatever reality this obscure accusation may have designated in the past, in a country that, despite the proximity, we felt was not our country anyway. Childhood impressions can be lasting. So that's an example of trying to rely on my own personal experience, not only to tell a story, but to articulate the content of the book. It's about emotions, and it's about a term that is used in Italian. It's a very strong term in all languages, but in Italian you feel it even more. When you use it, it's an accusation, and the immediate emotional response is say, "Oh no, not me." Like with racism, if you're racist or sexist, it creates that distance. And yet, if I narrate it from a personal biographical standpoint, it also suggests that we are all kind of vulnerable to one degree or another to those accusations, and might react in similar terms when confronted with it. And that's why I say childhood impressions can be lasting, and the notion of impression is one that I borrow from Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, for instance. In chapter 3, I will speak about the power of leaders to generate myths that create an impression on the psychic life of the subject. And so there are concepts at play, but displayed in a narrative mode in order to draw the reader in. And basically there is the idea of the border. I'm in Switzerland, Italy is over there, and it inverses. So like that's also mimetic technique. It's a mirror to say, well, you might be inside a country and actually be participating in the fascism that you're projecting on the other side of the wall. And so there is a kind of narrative dimension to the beginning that then is explained from a more kind of philosophical distance in the chapters. So that's not so much an explaining, but it's putting the reader in the mood, let's say.
So let's just maybe explore this fascism a little bit more. So the title of the book is New Fascism, Contagion, Community Myth, and the new is in the brackets. To some extent we've already kind of explored that, but do you want to say something why this new fascism is in the brackets? What's so new about it, and why we have to have some sort of a suspension there, this bracketing still?
Right. The phenomenological influence. No, it's a good question. Initially, I started writing the new fashions without brackets, and then after a while, I'm working on my thesis. It can be so new. It can be something that is radically new, and so the title "New Fascism" is indeed meant to generate a back and forth between historical fascism of the 20s and 30s. And what might be new, but in brackets, with kind of, let's see, I'm not sure, let's investigate in the present. I must say also that to use the term fascism to designate what is going on now on the far right is controversial. I was at the American Political Science Association just 3 weeks ago, now I'm kind of pulled in, and the term that is used there, well, it was all about this topic, but it's populism. It's not fascism. And I belong to a minority of figures, but they're actually getting more and more who actually think that fascism is, or neo-fascism, or aspirational fascism, are terms that better capture what is going on today. And a figure that was important for me in writing the book, an Italian figure, is Umberto Eco. He had written in 1995 an article for the New Yorker, 1995, entitled Urfascism. And it's actually the epigraph for the book. And what Umberto Eco does or says in that article is, it's true, fascism doesn't have an essence, doesn't have Mussolini didn't have a philosophical tone. The little philosophy that was came from Gentile, and there was no strong essence of fascism at play. But at the level of emotions, there is something that is constitutive what he calls ur-fascism, or eternal fascism. And among the kind of defining features of ur-fascism, he lists a number. But he lists, for instance, machismo, the contempt for the middle and the working class, the idea that there is a plot, and that somehow the nation is under attack, the use of impoverished language, newspeak, and he already speaks about the internet in '95, that might be used in TV shows and so forth. Of course, racism, hypernationalism, sexism, these are, he goes through a list of elements, and if you go through the list and you look at the contemporary, I think it's difficult not to see the analogies. And Eco says something that I used as the epigraph, and it's this. Says, ur-fascism can come back under the most innocent of disguises. Our duty is to uncover it and to point our finger at any of its new instances every day in every part of the world. And so basically that's the reason that I thought there are other scholars that have been writing on fascism after Eco, but this was an important one. So, well, yes, I think that this program is more important than ever. And then while I was writing the book, I mentioned aspirational fascism by Bill Connolly, and there is an interview or dialogue at the end. We might talk about that. But also Timothy Snyder wrote a short book on theory. A number of short books started to appear around 2016 that had the word fascism either in the title or in the content. And I thought what I could do would be add a mimetic perspective to this problematic that I thought was latent or implicit in these books, and that could be drawn out more explicitly, and specifically with these questions of affective contagion, community, and myth. So the fascism, in a way, it's old fascist. It's going back. It offers a genealogy of these three concepts, and looks at the way in which major figures who have thought about these three concepts can be mobilized in order to understand the fascism today. So hence the bracket, it's only fascism. What is new, I suspect, and I claim, is perhaps less at the level, what happens at the level of the message, like the racism and xenophobia and nationalism and militarism. That's not new. What seems to me new is the use of new media by political leaders in the age of the digital age, the internet. Facebook, Twitter, and so forth, that amplify the power of contagion in ways that require new diagnostics. And so the new refers to that, to the way in which political leaders now can take to the tweet and affect simultaneously millions of people at the same time who receive an individual message from a president, which then is taken as a model by other presidents, and that has enormous power of impression, to use again that term. So the first chapter, for instance, starts with an account of the reality TV show that Donald Trump had before running for president, The Apprentice. And there I thought, well, reading skills that come out of aesthetics and literary criticism are very useful in order to understand how a fiction can actually pave the way for a political reality which is modeled on fiction. And that the boundary between fiction and reality can easily be deconstructed if you analyze how mimesis operates in a reality show like The Apprentice. So that's just an example of what I consider new. Not radically new, I mean, it's not the first time that actors turn into presidents, but significantly new in terms of the innovations that have been taking place. We talked last week at a conference on Blumenberg and myth about the role of algorithm, for instance, in shaping public opinion, and that is something that is part of the book, and that is constitutive of new mimetic phenomena that I think require to be studied. So the new refers to that.
Yeah, let me, because you stole the first quotation which I wanted to actually explore,
okay.
So let me turn to the second, which actually ties well to where you are ending with your response, by Friedrich Nietzsche from The Gay Science. It goes as follows: it is thus that the maddest and most interesting ages of history always emerge when the actors, all kinds of actors, become the real masters. And what kind of discuss that in a sense, but do you mind saying a bit more why this quotation is important for the whole book? It opens the very introduction of the book.
Right. Yes, Nietzsche is say the main figure. It's not quoted that much. There is no chapter on Nietzsche, but he is one of the main figures that allowed me to rethink mimesis from a theatrical, as you mentioned, embodied, performative perspective. And he has this phrase. Nietzsche has these diagnostic arrows that it's written like more than 100 years ago, and you read them in 2016. Actors would be the real masters. And oh yeah, I can understand that. The reason I find that quote particularly telling is because Nietzsche has a sophisticated understanding of mimesis, because he was a philologist, he was trained in classics, and so when he makes the connection between the master and the actors, he has a certain form of mimesis in mind, which he very often groups under the rubric of Dionysian mimesis. So it's not an image, it's not an Apollonian representation. It has to do with impersonations that generates form of rausch or intoxication, and so that diagnostic is important because the figure of the mime or the mimos, and Nick is working on that, is a kind of the connecting thread between the chapters, and as part of a general operation which we are attempting in the Homo Mythicus project to shift understandings of mimesis towards embodiment, performance, affectivity, and Nietzsche is a very strong ally for that. But also the phrase, I think, captures very neatly why mimesis needs to be rethought from a political perspective.
Maybe.
And then maybe a couple more questions, but then maybe we should open it up.
Maybe just last question, then we'll just open it for questions. Time-wise, Michael Bohr-Jakobsen, who the author of the foreword to your book, he ends his foreword with a chilling pronouncement that Nomen imitates Dante's descent into hell. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Bohr-Jakobsen talks about abandoning all illusion before entering hell, right?
Yeah.
How do you read that? And as an extension of that question is the other part of it, which is, do you think that, all things considered, your book kind of ends on this pessimistic vision of the future of politics?
So it's an interesting question. Once again, let's split content and form. At the level of content, absolutely. I mean, it's not a cheerful topic, right? And calling it fascism as opposed to populism calls attention to the danger of the contemporary political situation. And the type of mimetic perspective I adopt indeed undermines a certain faith in human rationality, Homo sapiens as kind of rational, autonomous, self-sufficient subject, and stresses what we call homo mimeticus, a subject that is open to emotions, and especially in crowds, but not only, can be manipulated. So in that sense, yes, the subject is dark. I didn't mention it, but one of the reasons that I was trained to read the contemporary situation is like I spent 10 years of my life reading Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. I think that Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and it needs no introduction here, is a wonderful illustration of fascist psychology. and diagnostic of that. We know little about this enigmatic figure, Mr. Kurtz, in the center of the Congo. We don't know much about the horror, but Conrad tells us that he had a voice. He could not write a bit, but he certainly could speak. How that man could talk? He was like a child. He could believe anything, Kurtz. And he was hollow at the core. And so, Heart of Darkness, zooms in on the fact that a charismatic leader can be hollow at the core, be like a child, but with that voice, he could electrify large meetings in Europe. These are quotes, and so you wonder why. And I think my Mises is at play in Heart of Darkness and is at play on the contemporary political scene. So yes, it's dark. Abandon every hope, you that enter. Then at the level of form, I know Mikkel because I worked with him. I did graduate work with him at the University of Washington, and that's something that the reader can know. But I remember writing my first essay for a class. It was an essay on Bataille, and so I used Dante's phrase "Lasciate ogni speranza voi che entrate" in the Bataille world, saying that the notion of sovereign communication in Bataille is an attempt to confront death, but once you enter, you don't return. There is no paradise in Bataille, and so Mikkel is between us, alluding to that which to me I read as a wonderful compliment, because when you have a teacher quoting the former student, it means he appreciated it. Because he told me after I've written that essay that I should publish it, and I said, yeah, he's being very nice, but so he meant it.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have some time for questions. So, floor is yours.
Maybe just one last point on the pessimistic note. Yes, it's pessimistic, but it ends, and it's to balance maybe Mikkel's warning in the dialogue with Connolly. I just read you the last paragraph. To conclude on an affirmative note, let me stress the importance of the general strike that you call an improbable necessity. William Connolly, in a book titled Facing the Planetary that we will be reading in a couple of weeks, argues for the necessity to mobilize a general strike, and he calls it an improbable necessity. The book came out in 2017. And I say, in the wake of the cumulative scandalous political actions and mimetic reactions that do not simply repeat European fascism, but entangle new powers with non-human planetary forces in such catastrophic ways, I'm even tempted to think or hope that a vital improbability will, in the near future, turn into an emerging, perhaps even probable, possibility. So the possibility of a general strike with respect to climate change, this happened this interview took place in 2017, so before Greta started striking. But it's something that is in line with the book, in the sense that my Mises can really go both ways. I stress the negative side because the topic of the book is fascism, but I think it could go on the other way too, and the last events show that indeed there is mimetic behavior that is positive, and is another way.
Excellent. Time for some questions.
What you say reminds me of a claim that Hannah Arendt makes in the Origins of Totalitarianism, where she says, well, one of the characteristics of authoritarian figures there is that they are constantly on the move, they're constantly changing. Not because they have an ideological problem, but for the change itself, action for action's sake. That's also one of the defining characteristics that Umberto Eco lists in the Eternal Fascism. And so indeed, I don't see any strong political program at play, except with respect to the policies that they really push, like the anti-immigration, the kind of capital investment. It's kind of an extension of neoliberal capitalism, and the playing on the fears in order to come to power. But I don't see a philosophy or a Weltanschauung in the sense that you could see partially in Nazism, for instance. No, you don't have anything of that sort. You have movement and action for action's sake, and distraction from one scandal to the next. That's why the figure of the actor, the chameleon, seems to me so apt to define some of these figures. They have no essence, they have no core, but they have an ability to change and play the situation in order that works on what I call the mimetic register. But there is no logos, there is no ideology. Yeah, that has to do, I think, with the kind of limits of the book. What the book attempts to do is really understand the emotional relationship between the leader and the voters. And in that sense, I wouldn't make a kind of strong distinction between what Hannah Arendt, even though she had way less kind of critical view of the crowd and of the power of manipulating crowd behavior than I do, but I wouldn't make a strong distinction between totalitarianism and what I grew up under New Fascism. Timothy Snyder uses the notion of tyranny, the authoritarian personality, Adorno and Horkheimer. I think a lot of that work is useful still to understand that specific problem. I think that the question of mimesis foregrounds the efficacy of those strategies that might be downplayed, for instance, in Arendt's account of totalitarianism. I think she downplays it. If you read even around like Hitler and Mussolini, they were readers of Le Bon. They quoted the notion of suggestion in order to account for the relationship between crowds and leaders, and they explicitly relied on those techniques. So I think that there is a power there that might be underestimated by certain dominant tendencies in political theory, but that new tendencies, like we mentioned Bill Connolly, Jane Bennett, are very attentive to because they've been informed by affect theory and humanitarianism and kind of schools in continental philosophy that are more receptive to what Connolly calls the visceral register of cultural life. Mm-hmm. What he calls the visceral register of cultural life, for me, it's an equivalent of the mimetic unconscious. They're embodied, it's relational, it has to do with what Nietzsche would group under the figure of the Dionysian, right? Of sexuality generates the strange movements of attraction or repulsion in which a scandal doesn't bring one down, actually contributes to the popularity. So those aspects, I think, are specific to my diagnostic. And on the question of infrastructure, I would have to do more work to give you an informed answer because I didn't focus on that. What I find reassuring is that they are holding these structures, at least. If you look at the contemporary cases, examples in England, the impeachment, let's see. But there is a resistance that is there because these infrastructures are holding up for the moment. For the moment.
Okay, Julia 2, Philip 3, and Gentleman in Black 4.
It's really strange, and I'm glad you asked that question because indeed it seems that the term itself it's more important than the actual facts. It's very similar to racism or sexism. Racist behavior is just there, it's obvious, but if one is called racist, then there are big discussions. Is it really racism or not? Where there should really be no question. And with fascism, I think it is the same. What I find problematic in the notion of populism that is let's say more popular or used more is that it groups under the same umbrella policies that are so radically different and so radically opposed, so that rampant anti-environmentalism is on the same side of Save the Planet, or kind of education and health insurance for all, it's the same back as children in camps. That seems to me very problematic, and it's a way of downplaying and kind of confusing. From the moment we have one term to designate two radically different political attitudes, then it generates more confusion and it buys into the rhetoric of leaders who say, oh, we are populist, while they're obviously working for the elite. It seems to me a buying into that. So I think that there is the number of books on fascism that have appeared since I started writing this book is amazing. Couldn't keep up because otherwise I wouldn't have written it, but at least 4 or 5 books while I was writing that I managed to refer to, and more that came out since. So I think that there is a growing awareness of the importance of calling the phenomenon what it is, at least to alert to the danger. As to why, I see it especially in the US, so that kind of attention to the language, and the language being more problematic than the action. And I think it might be part of a culture of political correctness that is, of course, something that is appropriated by the new fascists, but that nonetheless implicates the left in ways that end up being complicit with what they're condemning by not calling it, because it's too problematic, it's too confrontational, the term is too loaded. We don't want to make statements that might cause too much controversy. And so the rhetoric is diminished, is softened, and that's why I think that calling it what it is a step ahead. The technology is a pharmacon, right? I mean, it depends what we do with it. It can go both ways. What I found useful among the pioneers of those who studied the question of media, I often mention it, is Gabriel Tarde. He is the author of The Laws of Imitation, which is his kind of well-known book. He has written another book titled L'opinion à la foule, the opinion in the crowd. And there he counters Le Bon's claim that we're entering the age of crowds. Crowds are like physical people being assembled and being mobilized by passion. Say, no, we're not entering the age of crowds, we're entering the age of publics. And he defined the public as a virtual crowd. That is, a crowd in which people are connected, but not physically, mentally. They're mentally connected. And how does that connection work? He says, well, his example are newspapers. The public is the readership of newspapers, is by reading the same information at the same time and believing that thousands of others are reading it at the same time, that makes it effective and effective. The fact that it's a shared readership. And that generates what he calls a mental contagion at a distance, contagion distance. And I think that model is useful to think about when you're talking about with Twitter. And I think that the problem is indeed accentuated. And what I found problematic in the media is not only a question of false representations of reality. The traditional definition of mimesis as a false copy, faithful to the truth. It's not only that is a good part of it, but it's not the only one. It's the affective power of the media. And the fact that there are these bubbles of information that are generated by algorithms that feed us what we are already predisposed to feel emotionally, that feed us news we are already receptive to because they're part of our ideology, I think amplifies the power of influence, of mimetic influence of new technology. I think it's a major problem. Tarde worries, and I say it in the first chapter, it's on crowd psychology, worries about an age in which one person will get the news only from one newspaper. He's worried about that. And I say, well, you didn't live long enough to say, you don't even read the papers, you get the news from your Facebook account, right? So that's scary. So I agree, it is a problem, and it's something that needs to be studied. And in the book, I pinpoint that problematic, but I think that the technology is changing so fast that more work needs to be done. I think it's a good point. Keep in mind, I started writing in 2016 and I finished it in 2017. And it takes 2 years to be out. And so I was worried primarily about the question of how do these people get elected. That was the main concern. But I think you're absolutely right that the main problem of these figures is to remain in power. If they don't operate within kind of oligarchic system, like in the case of Russia, then you stay in power. But for instance, the case of the US, I think, it's we see it unraveling now. You can manage to get to power, and you can manage to create 4 years of immense chaos and destruction. But I think it's difficult to remain in power, which doesn't mean that they cannot manage somehow. So what you can learn from fascism is that there are techniques, start a war, for instance, in order to do that. But indeed, that's something also Timothy Snyder mentions in the Road to Unfreedom, that the major problems of authoritarian figures is to remain in power, so the continuity. And I think also these swings, these kind of radical swings from left to right, coupled by economic crisis, immigration crisis, and so forth, are a big part of the success. Right, that's one of the, from the very beginning, one of the paradoxes and problems of mimesis. That's why I refer to Plato quite often, because it's the paradigmatic case of that, right? I mean, he's so critical of mimesis, not only for, not saying the truth, shadows and so forth, but also he's critical of mimetic speech. And that's the first time that mimesis comes up in Republic. It's the question of speech. When an actor speaks in the first person, not in the third person. And what he does, he writes dialogues, right? He writes dialogues in which he hides mimetically under the mask of Socrates, tells stories, allegories, in order to critique mimesis. And I think that, Derrida's Plato's Pharmacy is the classic text on that paradox. Mimesis is a pharmacon. I call it a pathology, and I spell the pathology with a dash, or by saying that yes, it can be a sickness, but what I find interesting in the figures that I mentioned, from Nietzsche to Bataille to Tartre, Conrad and so forth, Lacoue-Labarthe and C, is that they have a refined understanding of mimesis because they're somehow effectively implicated in what they diagnose. They are implicated in the mimetic pathos. They have an experience, a phenomenological experience of what mimesis is. And because of that, they can develop a logos, an account of how it works. So I don't see any contradiction, or at least that's the kind of mimetic theory that we propose. It's one that embraces this double movement and doesn't try to pinpoint mimesis on one side of the good and evil divide, because it can go both ways.
If you want to know more about what we do, visit our website, and we have also a Facebook page.
Shame on you! There you go.
I'm running it.
Fully implicated in the
so yes, also if you want to leave your email, I'm happy to add you to our list. Thanks so much for coming, and just grab a drink. Thanks.
Thank you so much.